Hello and welcome. I'm Peasant. I was born in England, I live in England, and I'm going to help you beat England. Let's go. So the first two rules to talk about are the additional loss condition and the escalation. So proud and mighty capital. If 7 or more buildings are ever in a single land, the invaders win. That land with the most invaders in on each board, I call the London, because that's the capital of England there. We're learning here. The escalation on each board with buildings built in the land with most buildings, aka London. So how do you play around this? Partly by manipulating where London is. So if you have push towns, you can use that to make sure London's where you want it to be. And where do you want it to be? Where you're strongest. Clearly, it wouldn't be on a land that's already blighted. It might be on the coast if you're ocean, or it might be by your big cluster of Dahan if you're thunder speaker, that kind of thing. And you do have some ability to manipulate it. And so you want to make sure it's where you want it to be. Now, the escalation effect, it means that stage 2, when escalation effects happen, is a very dangerous time from the point of view of losing to proud and mighty capital, because those builds are going exactly where you don't want them to go. You want to make sure that you keep that London as trimmed down as you can. Now, playing at higher difficulty, sometimes your London is very big and you're on the edge of loss all the way through. So it's often the case that when the escalation effect is no longer in play, you can actually kind of not worry about London so much. Now, I'm saying you just ignore London and that loss condition, but you really want to focus on keeping your London as trimmed as possible during stage 2. At level 1 difficulty, we have indentured servants earn land. Invader build cards affect matching lands without invaders if they're adjacent to at least 2 buildings. Little rules note on this is that a build will not empower another build as part of the same build, right? So if you build a town in a land that doesn't satisfy the condition for there being 2 adjacent towns in that same build phase, because it kind of checks which lands are eligible for the build, and then you build in those lands. Even at high difficulty, you will be able to potentially prevent builds in the early game and possibly in the late game. I would say, as a general theme for playing against England, you do this when you can, but the main thing is you really need to be on your game plan of powering up your spirit as quickly as possible. England is the slowest possible invader at this point. They have a standard invader deck. You have an amount of time. That's their weakest spot. So you've got the time to power up. You mustn't get too sidetracked from gaining powers, placing presence, gaining major powers. So if you can prevent a build and it without too much detouring, do it. But otherwise, plow forward with presence placement and gaining useful powers. So at level 3 and 4, we've got a high immigration. So either we've got a temporary high immigration or we've got a full-time high immigration. That's this puppy here. How do we play around this? What are the consequences? Well, there are going to be high immigration builds that are mostly irrelevant, or they're just kind of out in the way in a place that's not about to ravage. What do we take home from this? Nothing different to what we're saying in the first level of difficulty, which is just keep on building your raw destructive power. There's going to be a whole load of extra buildings on the map, so you need things and powers that have the ability to destroy a lot at a single time. Super useful against England. But you are also going to have the unfortunate situation. It's almost guaranteed to happen at least one game. It is possible that it won't show up in some situations, but what I'm talking about is build into ravage. So that typically, how is it horrible? Well, because if you forget, like me, and you forget that that's going to add to the attack, your defense might not be high enough. And also, it might mean that an empty land suddenly has a ravage in the unexpected. So you've got to try and pay attention to that. But there is a general idea when you have build into ravage or ravage into build lands, is that if you can set up Dahan counterattacks in there, then that's often a winning plan. Dahan damage is very efficient damage. If you can set that up, it can be good, because then sometimes the counterattack from the Dahan will clear the land, and it won't, of course, prevent the build against England, because probably in most situations, but it will mean that you are destroying stuff. You are, gaining fear, whittling away at the English morass of buildings. So at level 5, we have local autonomy, which is where buildings all have an additional health. This is a really big step up in difficulty, and for some spirits is bigger than others. The classic example is River, who goes from being in a position where they can pretty much just clear an entire land without too much difficulty. All of a sudden local autonomy shows up and River has a much harder time. And to beat England 5 or 6 with River is a very different game to if you were beating England up to 4. So, there is actually a video on the channel where I'm doing that. So So how does this change it? It kind of switches your emphasis more towards things that are destroying towns, destroying cities, rather than doing 2 damage or 3 damage. So more towards that, and some spirits become even better against England, for example, lightning or ocean, in comparison to the other spirits. It doesn't really change that much, apart from making River have a cry, because you've still got the same game plan, right? You know, that's just it's just harder. So at level 6, we've got independent resolve. So we are messing with our fear pool, adding a fear per player, and we've also got the potential for a double build in the high immigration slot if we don't have a fear card to resolve that turn. So for some spirits, this changes nothing, right? So for Bringer of Dreams and Nightmares, for example, this is they may as well, if you were thinking of playing at 5, you may as well play at 6. But for a lot of spirits that aren't just generating fear anyway, it does make a big difference. Don't freak out if one of these slips through. You can still win if 1 or even 2 slip through. I mean, I'm not saying it's good to do that, but it's also not necessarily an insta-loss. How do you respond to this effect? Well, if you're not generating fear, you want to be gaining a fear card of some kind. Typically, there are some great fear cards. I'll probably put them behind my head to show off. And generally, once you've got to this high difficulty, I will make a generalization here against almost any adversary, though getting some cheap fear cards and slipping them in will make a big difference to your win rate. A particular nuance with beating independent resolve at level 6 is that sometimes in the early game you might want to deliberately not gain a fear card and kind of delay that ability by kind of choosing what you play on what turn until the point where it actually makes a difference on that rule. So it's a bit of a nuance, but it can make a difference because in that early game, of course, you're not going to be destroying that much. You're not powered up that much. And getting that early double build can make a huge difference to how defendable the board is in general. Let's talk a little bit about blight removal. So in your London land, it's typically going to be quite built up and often is going to be very hard to defend. Easy way to prevent disastrous cascades is just to yoink the blight. Just let it ravage, let it drop a blight, and then play a minor power that you've picked up just to remove the blight. Because a lot of the time you're going to have to just let England do what they're doing while you power up. And this is a very low cost way of preventing cascades. What about action skips against England? Well, Paralysing Fright is probably one of the strongest mages against England because potentially if you are preventing all invader actions in a land, you could be preventing many, many builds and potentially just not losing. The other nice thing is smaller action skips, things like Green's ability to prevent a build can also mean that you can leave a land a little bit closer to the edge of loss condition with London and still be focusing on your own growth rather than fretting about losing. So I would say in general, action skips are very valuable against England. For example, Rocky, or Earth as some people call them, they do have their Year of Perfect Stillness power, which is often a trap power, and often probably a power you want to forget early. But against England, it can be incredibly valuable for keeping you in the game until you get the major powers you need to smash those limeys into oblivion. So about England 6. My recommendation for your first win against England 6 in solo spirit would be Ocean. They are incredibly strong in solo, just straight up strong, and particularly suited to munching on England. The other thing I would say about England's 6 victories, or just beating England in general, is that don't expect to be fully clearing the map. It's incredibly hard to fully clear them, and unless you can kind of have them tucked in a corner of the coastline. So you're probably going to be winning in solo spirit with a fear victory, like a Terror 4 fear victory. Or, I mean, because it's just so hard to fully eradicate the English. They're like cockroaches. So that about wraps it up for this little guide on how to beat England. I hope it's helpful. If there's anything I've missed, feel free to put it in the comments below. And if there are enough missing things, I might make an addendum or even just remake the video. It took hours. Also, a special thanks to my Patreons. If you like these videos, help me justify all the time I'm just not actually working by supporting me on Patreon.